April 1983. Hardin County, Tennessee. The morning smelled of iron and standing water, the particular cold smell of ground that has been wet too long, and Earl Hutchins stood at the east bank of his stock pond at first light with the toe of his boot pressed into the cracked mud at the shoreline, reading it the way his father had taught him to read ground, not with his eyes first, but with the pressure of his weight and the sound the soil made underneath him. The sound it made was nothing. No suction. No resistance. The ground beneath the clay bank had gone dry 3 feet from the water's edge, which meant the liner was failing. Not crumbling, not collapsing, just slowly releasing, the way old clay does when freeze-thaw cycles have worked through it for enough winters. Earl was 62 years old. He had farmed this 180 acres for 35 years, and he had built that pond with his own hands in 1961, and now it was going. He had 40 head of cattle on this land, mostly commercial Angus Hereford cross cows, worth in the neighborhood of $450 each at current prices, roughly $18,000 on the hoof, and every one of those animals depended on that pond through the dry months of July and August when Brushy Creek ran low, and the municipal line he had run in 1974 produced barely enough pressure for the house. Without the pond, he would have to sell. Not some of them. All of them. A man does not keep cattle on dry land in Hardin County in summer without a functioning water source. He had $2,300 in his farm operating account. He owed $40,000 on the property note to First Federal in Savannah, a loan he had refinanced in 1980 at 14.5% because he had no choice, and neither did anyone else that year. The note required quarterly payments of $1,850. If he missed 2, the bank's policy was to accelerate the full balance. Earl had not missed 1 in 11 years. The week before, he had driven to Savannah and sat across from a man named Gary Profit, who ran a waterproofing and earthwork company out of a metal building near the highway. Profit had walked the pond with him for 20 minutes and written a number on a lined notepad page and handed it across. The number was $15,200. That was the cost of excavating the failed liner, importing commercial sodium bentonite, the powdered clay compound used in professional pond sealing, spreading it in 2-inch lifts, tilling it into the existing soil, and compacting it to specification. Profit said the price was fair for the work involved. He was probably right, but it was a number Earl did not have and could not borrow because the farm had already been pledged as collateral twice over. Earl folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket and drove home. He did not call his wife inside to tell her the number. He stood at the kitchen window for a while. Then he went back out. There was, in the county extension office in Savannah, a man named Marvin Shelby who had served as the agricultural and natural resources agent for Hardin County since 1975. Shelby was 44 years old, held a master's degree in soil science from the University of Tennessee, and took his position seriously. He drove a green 1981 Chevrolet Silverado and kept his shirts tucked in even on farm visits. In early May of 1983, Earl called the extension office and made an appointment, and on a Thursday morning he sat across from Marvin Shelby and described what he was thinking. He was thinking, he explained, that construction sites excavated a great deal of clay in the course of their work. particularly the high-plasticity clays that were, in Shelby's own terminology, unsuitable for structural fill. He was thinking that this material was typically hauled off at the contractor's expense, sometimes driven 30 miles to a permitted disposal area. He was thinking that if a man could identify a source of that clay and haul it himself, he might be able to line a stock pond for the cost of fuel and his own time. Marvin Shelby listened. Then he leaned back in his office chair and looked at the wall for a moment. He said, "Mr. Hutchins, homemade pond repair doesn't hold. I've seen men try variations of this for 20 years. The problem isn't the clay, the problem is consistency of compaction and moisture control. You can't achieve the required density with farm equipment. Buy the liner or lose the pond." He was not unkind. He was not dismissing Earl the way a man dismisses a fool. He was dismissing him the way a man dismisses a proposal that he has already seen fail, which is something different but produces the same result. He was also, in a significant technical sense, wrong, though he did not know it yet. On the way out, Earl passed through the hall where 3 other farmers waited on plastic chairs. One of them was a man named Curtis Beale who farmed corn in the river bottom east of Savannah. Beale looked at Earl as he passed and said, "Extension tell you no," Earl said. "Something like that." Beale nodded as if that confirmed something he already knew, and Earl went through the door into the afternoon. At the Logston Feed and Hardware in Cerro Gordo 2 weeks later, he mentioned what he was considering to Roy Farrell, who farmed the adjacent place and had himself lost a pond to seepage in 1979 and never replaced it. Farrell said, "Extension told you it won't work, and Extension's right. Bentonite is bentonite. You can't haul construction dirt and call it the same thing." 3 other men in the store that morning said nothing, which in a Tennessee feed store is a form of agreement. Earl said probably so, and bought a 50-pound sack of mineral supplement and went home. He had not told any of them what he knew. What he knew came from a composition notebook, navy blue cover, white label, the label blank now, the ink having faded decades ago, stored in a tin box on the 3rd shelf of the tack room. His father, Raymond Hutchins, had kept that notebook from 1941 until 1970, and in it he had recorded, in a compact vertical hand, every significant observation he had ever made about the soil on this property. Raymond had died in 1971 of a heart attack in the middle of disking the south field, and Earl had read the notebook so many times in the years since that certain passages had fixed themselves in his memory with the permanence of scripture. In June of 1949, Raymond had lined a small stock pond on the north end of the farm using clay excavated from a road-cut project on State Route 128, 3 miles east. The highway department had cut through a ridge in 1948 and left a spoil pile of dense, blue-gray clay that the contractor called fat clay and wanted nothing to do with. Raymond had hauled it over 11 weekends in a 1946 GMC flatbed, spread it in 6-inch lifts, and compacted each lift by driving his 1939 Farmall M. The red one, the one Earl still remembered his father climbing down from at dusk with his back straight despite the hours, back and forth across it, until the clay surface cracked in a continuous network that Raymond described in the notebook as alligator skin in wet leather. Then he had flooded it, and sealed it with a final 2-inch top dress before the water came up. That pond had held for 22 years without a repair. What Raymond had understood, and what the Extension Office's institutional memory had never absorbed, was the specific functional difference between sodium bentonite and natural high-plasticity clay in pond applications. Commercial bentonite swells when wet, which is what makes it effective. Natural fat clay, the kind geologists classify as CH on the Unified Soil Classification System, achieves the same impermeability through a different mechanism: compaction density. If you lay it in thin enough lifts, compact it at the right moisture content, close to what soil scientists call optimum moisture content for that specific clay type, and allow it to hydrate slowly, it seals as effectively as any engineered product on the market in 1983. Raymond had never used that language. He had written, "Clay packed wet but not too wet, like bread dough before the rise, heavy, smooth, holds its shape when you ball it. That is the stuff." The gap between what the Extension Office believed and what Raymond Hutchins had proved in 1949 was not philosophical. It was measurable. It was a 22-year-old intact liner versus an institutional assumption that farm equipment could not achieve adequate compaction density. Both could not be true. Earl had walked that North Pond in 1971, in 1975, in 1980. The liner was still holding when he sold the North Pasture in 1982 to cover a repair on the hay barn. The pond had outlasted the institution's confidence in it by 2 full decades. Earl had spent 40 years watching construction sites. He knew what fat clay looked like when it came out of the ground. He knew which projects in Hardin County were excavating through the right geology, and he had a rough mental map of the county's subsurface clay deposits built from 4 decades of watching road cuts, basement excavations, tile ditching projects, and drainage work. None of that was written anywhere. It lived in him. He did not announce any of this. He began driving. In the summer of 1983, 3 major construction projects operated in Hardin County. A new elementary school in Savannah was going in on a site that a local contractor named Danny Huey was excavating to 14 feet. A county road project on Pickwick Road was cutting through a hill that Earl had driven past since childhood and knew from its color and texture to be limestone underlain clay. A commercial warehouse development outside Adamsville was cutting its foundation pads and hauling spoil in Mack dump trucks to a field 3 miles south. Earl drove to all 3 sites in July. He did not ask permission first. He walked the spoil piles where they were accessible from the road and crouched down and picked up handfuls of material and squeezed them in his fist. At the school site, the clay was gray-brown and sticky and left a film on his palm that was slow to dry. It balled cleanly and held its shape for 20 seconds. At the road project, the material was siltier, more granular. Not right. At the warehouse site outside Adamsville, the clay was the color of a bruise, almost purple-gray, and when he balled it in his palm, it held so clean it left a fingerprint. He drove home and called Danny Huey's office. Huey listened to what Earl proposed and said, "You want to haul our excess. You're telling me you'll take it off my hands?" Earl said yes. Huey said he would check with his site engineer, But if it was legal and Earl could move fast enough not to block operations, he saw no reason to refuse. Huey was paying $18 per load to dispose of that material at a permitted site in Wayne County. 3 days later, they shook hands. Earl would take the fat clay from the school excavation at no cost to either party. The warehouse operator in Adamsville reached the same arrangement for the same reasons. Two sources, both free. Earl's hauling equipment was a 1968 Ford F600 farm truck, white cab, rusted stake bed body, with a rebuilt 240 cubic inch straight six that Earl had taken apart and put back together himself in 1979. The truck could carry between 4 and 5 tons per load, depending on the clay's moisture content. He rigged a plywood tailgate extension to increase the bed volume by roughly a third, and welded chain hooks to the frame for the tarp he used to reduce road spillage. The compaction equipment was a 1963 International Harvester TD9 crawler dozer, the orange that International used on that series, worn and scratched, and faded nearly to cream on the blade and the engine hood, with 6,800 hours on the meter, and a 9-foot straight blade that Earl had rebuilt with replacement cutting edges from a dealer in Lawrenceburg in 1978. The dozer weighed approximately 16,000 pounds. On clay at optimum moisture, its track ground pressure was sufficient to achieve meaningful compaction density with enough passes. Earl's father had proved the principle with a Farmall M, which weighed considerably less. The TD9 would do it better. He began hauling in September of 1983. The school site was active through October, and Earl made 22 loads, working 2 evenings a week after dark to avoid the site's daytime traffic. Each load took him 40 minutes to travel from Savannah, dump, and return. He stockpiled the clay above the pond's high water line on the north bank, covered it with a salvaged grain tarp weighted down with old fence posts, and let it condition in the autumn humidity through October. In November, when Huey's crew moved to concrete work and the excavation ended, Earl began the liner work itself. He dewatered the pond first, pumping it down over 2 weeks with a 3-inch gas-powered trash pump borrowed from his neighbor Lena Draper, who farmed 80 acres to the south and said nothing beyond yes when he asked. He exposed the existing liner, which came up in plates when he drove the TD9 over it, dry, cracked, the clay crumbling at the edges like old mortar. He scraped the failed material to the banks, stripped to undisturbed subsoil, and cut the slopes to a 3-to-1 ratio with the dozer blade, the angle his father's notebook specified for clay liner stability. The first lift of new clay went down in the second week of November 1983. 6 inches deep, spread with the dozer blade, then moisture conditioned by hand with water run from the trash pump pulling from a temporary stock tank. Earl checked moisture content by the ball test his father had described, not a soil gauge, not a penetrometer, just the palm of his hand, pressing and releasing. And when the clay held a clean ball with a dull surface and did not stick to his fingers, he ran the TD9 back and forth in overlapping passes. 8 passes per section, counted aloud. He stopped when the surface showed the network of fine cracks his father had recorded. Continuous, tight, the clay surface unyielding underfoot. The dozer engine ran at moderate throttle in the cold November air, exhaust rising straight in the still mornings. The tracks working through the clay with a rhythmic compression Earl felt through the operator's platform into the soles of his boots. The smell of freshly turned clay in cold air is mineral and slightly sour, like well water from a deep source. He worked 4-hour stretches and then walked the section and worked again. By December, he had placed 3 lifts on the pond floor and 2 on the lower slopes. The temperature dropped hard in mid-December, and he stopped work and covered the exposed clay with hay bales to keep the frost from penetrating. He worried through January about the freeze. His wife Margaret said nothing about the pond during those months. She had been married to him for 38 years, and she understood what silence during a project meant. In February of 1984, Roy Farrell drove up the lane in his truck and stood at the pond bank, looking at the hay-covered clay. He said, "Extension's still saying it won't hold, Earl." Earl said, "I know what they're saying." Farrell stood there another minute and then drove back out. Spring came dry in 1984. Earl resumed work in March, placed 2 more lifts on the upper slopes, and by the first week of April had the liner complete 12 feet of clay on the floor, 5 feet on the slopes, everything compacted to the point where walking across it in rubber boots left no impression deeper than a heel print. He opened the tile drain on the east side and let the pond fill with spring rain. In early May, a section on the northeast slope showed a seep. He found it on a Thursday morning, a dark stain of moisture working through the new clay about 8 feet up from the floor, visible only because the morning light came low and flat across the bank. The weight of the discovery settled on him the way that kind of thing does, not as surprise, but as confirmation of the fear he had carried since November. He stood at that seep for a long time with his hands in his jacket pockets. He cut the section out. He dewatered the affected area with the trash pump, excavated 6 inches past the seep face, and pulled 3 samples by hand to examine. The clay was sandy. He had grabbed that load from the edge of the school excavation spoil pile where it bordered a lens of sandy material, and had not caught the contamination in the original inspection because the surface clay had been pure. It cost him 3 weeks in May to repair it. He hauled 2 loads of the Adamsville clay specifically for the patch material he had held in reserve under the tarp, because it was the cleanest he had found. He relayed it in 4-inch lifts instead of 6, made 12 compaction passes instead of 8, and sealed the repair with a final hand-tamped cap along the joint edge. By early June of 1984, the pond held. The level climbed through June and stood full by mid-July, when the pastures went brown and the cattle pressed against the fence nearest the water in the evenings. Earl walked the perimeter every morning that July, pressing his boot into the bank at intervals, listening for suction, for the soft pop of saturated ground giving way. There was none. The liner held. He watched it through the summer of 1984 and through the fall, marking the water line on a wooden post at the south bank every 2 weeks with a pencil line and a date. The level dropped in August, evaporation and cattle draw, but within the normal range for a stock pond his size. It did not drop from seepage. He compared his measurements against what a surface that size should lose to evaporation alone, using a formula his father had recorded in 1953, and the numbers agreed within 6 inches. In November 1984, he sat at the kitchen table and wrote a list of what the work had cost him. Fuel for the F600 across 22 hauls, $148. The trash pump borrowed from Lena Draper, returned in fence labor at no cash cost, $0. Dozer fuel for all compaction work, $210. Hay bales for frost protection, resold in spring for what he paid, net $0. Hardware and miscellaneous, $60. Total direct cost, $418. Against this he placed the profit estimate from April 1983, $15,200. He kept both pieces of paper. He folded them together and put them in the tin box with his father's notebook. In the spring of 1985, when it was clear the pond had wintered without seepage loss, Earl drove to Savannah and walked into the extension office without an appointment and asked to speak to Marvin Shelby. Shelby was in. Earl sat across from him, set the 2 folded papers on the desk and slid them across without speaking. Shelby read both papers twice. He set them down and looked at his desk for a moment. He said, "When did you finish the liner?" Earl said, "April of last year." Shelby said, "And it wintered without failure." Earl said, "Yes." Shelby was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was wrong to tell you it couldn't be done." He said it without decoration. He was not a bad man. He had been wrong in the way institutional knowledge is often wrong, by treating a general statistical assumption as a physical law, and by letting the record of previous failures overrule a specific material reality he had not personally examined. He asked Earl for permission to visit the farm and document the method. Earl said he could come any time. 3 weeks later, a written update appeared in the Hardin County Extension quarterly newsletter, mailed to every agricultural address in the county. The update, attributed to Marvin Shelby, noted that natural high-plasticity clay, when properly identified by field plasticity tests, moisture conditioned to near optimum water content, and compacted in controlled lifts by tracked equipment, could serve as an effective alternative pond liner material in contexts where suitable source material was accessible at low or no cost from nearby construction excavations. It cited a Hardin County case study without naming the farmer. It provided specific guidance: lift thickness not to exceed 6 inches, compaction by tracked equipment, moisture content verified by the manual ball test, visual confirmation of the continuous crack pattern on each lift surface before the next was placed. It was the first time that guidance had appeared in any extension publication in the state of Tennessee. Roy Farrell read the newsletter at his kitchen table and drove to Earl's place that same afternoon. He stood at the pond with Earl and looked at the water, which was full and flat in the October light, the surface carrying a thin haze of humidity off the warm clay banks. Farrell said, "You did this last year." Earl said, "Yes." Farrell looked at it for a long time. He said, "Why didn't you say so?" It was not a question. Earl said nothing to it. Within 6 months, Farrell had relayed the method to his cousin in McNairy County who faced the same problem on a different pond. That man had no direct contact with Earl Hutchins. He identified a suitable clay source from a county road project east of Selmer, arranged the same kind of spoil removal agreement that Earl had made with Danny Huey, and built his liner across one fall and winter. By his own calculation, he saved $11,400 against the commercial bentonite quote he had received. The Hardin County Extension Office included the methodology in the revised edition of its Pond Management Bulletin in 1986, under the new heading, Alternative Liner Materials for Farm Ponds, Field-Sourced High-Plasticity Clay. The section on identifying suitable material drew directly from Marvin Shelby's field notes taken during his October 1985 visit to the Hutchins farm. Those notes, and the bulletin revision, remained in the county extension's official record. Any farmer who asked for them received them. Earl declined 3 separate invitations to speak at county agricultural meetings about the method. He told the extension assistant, who called each time, that Marvin Shelby could speak to it better than he could, and that the bulletin said everything worth saying. He was not being modest. He saw no reason to stand at a podium and describe something already written down correctly by someone with better credentials to deliver it. He continued working. The pond continued holding. In the early spring of 1988, 7 inches of rain fell over 9 days in March, and the surrounding fields went to mud while the pond held its level within 2 inches of overflow. Earl walked the bank the morning after the heaviest night, cold and gray, the air still carrying rain smell, the clay bank intact, no slippage, no cracking at the water line. He was 67 years old. He noted the water level on the post and walked back to the barn. The TD9 was in the barn by then, retired from field work but not from service. Earl serviced it in April and October of every year, oil changed, filters replaced, undercarriage pins inspected and greased, fuel system cleaned, blade lift cylinder checked for seep. He kept a service log on a 5x8 index card tacked inside the dozer's bay. Dates, services performed, hours since last service. By 1988, the machine showed 7,200 hours. Its engine ran without smoke at idle, which in a machine that age is a form of testimony. In August of 1998, Earl Hutchins had a stroke minor, the doctors said, but it took the full use of his left hand for 4 months and left a permanent slowness in that side. His son David, who had been farming in Robertson County, came home for the harvest and stayed. By January, it was clear he would not be going back north. Earl spent that winter walking David through the farm, not machinery operation, which David already knew, but the knowledge beneath the operation. The drainage patterns of each field, the soil types by section, the tile locations, the equipment maintenance schedules, the notebooks. One afternoon in February, they stood in front of the TD9 in the barn. The machine sat in its bay with the stillness that only very heavy things that are also very well maintained achieve. David put his hand on the hood and said, "Dad, this machine is 35 years old. Why do we keep it running?" Earl considered the question. He said, "Because the day I need it and don't have it, I will spend money I don't have to borrow one, and because it still knows what to do." He was not speaking about sentiment. He was speaking about operational reserve, the practical value of a tool maintained past its apparent obsolescence, because the knowledge embedded in using it correctly does not automatically transfer to a newer machine. A rented excavator and subcontract crew would have cost him $3,000 to do what the TD9 had done in 1983 for fuel. The fuel had cost $210. David looked at the index card log on the wall. The entries ran back to 1975 in his father's handwriting at 23 years of dates and service items, regular as fence posts. He said nothing more about the dozer. That winter Earl showed David the ball test, standing at the north fence line where the soil profile was the same CH clay that lined the pond. He pressed a ball of it into David's palm and said, "That is the moisture you want, not slicker, not stiffer." He paused. "Your grandfather called it bread dough before the rise." David held the ball of clay and turned it in his fingers. He understood it the way you understand a thing that has been demonstrated rather than explained, without resistance, without the need to question it. The clay held its shape. That was the test. That was all. The tin box passed to David along with the farm. The navy blue notebook with Raymond's entries from 1941 to 1970, and Earl's continuation entries from 1971 to 1997, in Earl's angular and deliberate hand. The entries covered pond liner work, soil classification by feel, clay identification at construction sites, equipment compaction calculations, moisture tests performed every April and September at 3 fixed locations on the farm. The last entry Earl made was in November 1997, when his hand had started to give him trouble. The next entry was in January 1998, in David's smaller and rounder handwriting. The line between them is visible on the page. The information on both sides is continuous. The pond on the Hutchins farm holds water. The liner Earl built across the fall and winter of 1983 and 1984, with $418 in direct costs, hauled in a white 1968 Ford F600 from 2 construction sites that were paying to dispose of the same material, compacted by a 1963 International Harvester TD9 that was already 20 years old when the work began, has never required structural repair. There have been patches at the inlet structure. There has been regrading at the North Bank Spillway after a washout in 1991. The liner itself sits beneath the water line, invisible and intact. The navy blue notebook is in the tin box on the shelf in the tack room, third from the top. The TD9 still runs. That is what it means to read the ground correctly. Not to know what the textbook says about the material in your hand, but to know what the material will do when you treat it according to its own nature rather than the nature you assume it has. Raymond Hutchins understood it in 1949. Earl understood it in 1983. David carries it now in a handwriting different from both of theirs, in a notebook that was old before any of them were born. The clay does not care who knows about it. It holds water because it was packed correctly, at the right moisture, in the right thickness, by a man who learned from a man who learned from the ground itself. That is the only knowledge that does not depreciate.